videos and resources on the TSF website. We're going to move into the next session now, which is really telling you a little bit about what we've learned along our journey. Really, one of the aims of TESF, besides funding these wonderful projects, has been to try and draw together, to synthesize, to weave together the learnings. And that in itself is an art form. It requires bringing in the voices of all those involved in the national workshops, in our synthesis week, which we held recently, in our legacy conference, where we all had the chance to reflect on what we've learned together, to listen and learn from each other's projects. And it's a real art. And I have the enormous pleasure now of introducing our hub leads or our hub partners who are going to be taking you through what we've learned under the different themes in the 4 breakout rooms. And this session is called The World We Want. It reflects the hope, but also the challenges ahead of us. Poonam, who you saw in the photo, has been on the journey right from the very start, and really has been a real force for pushing forward this agenda about inequalities. And she'll be leading that conversation in room 4.
Yeah, hi, Raphael. So I think we have about 55 minutes to have this discussion on inequalities, intersecting inequalities, as a cross-cutting theme of all the TSF research across the 67 projects across 4 countries. So I'm Poonam Batra, you have already heard a little bit, and I am co-lead as part of the TSF network and lead India. And you saw Amir in the video, who worked with me as co-lead anchoring TSF in IHS. So let me begin by sharing my screen. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. And does it look like a full screen?
Poonam, maybe you can zoom in a bit.
Okay. Yeah?
Yeah.
Does this look good?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to take you through this in about 10 minutes, if I can. A very formidable task of putting so much together. But let me begin with the challenge that we have, which is really that formal education and the way it is arranged and how it functions sustains inequalities. That is really the challenge that we are looking at as we started our work with the TSF. And clearly, we found that even through the TSF researches, that inequalities are complex, they are dynamic, they are intersecting, and they are rooted in both space and in time. And the education systems are unequal themselves, and they tend to mask the structural nature of inequalities, which also affects all aspects of life. And of course, these are exacerbated by intersecting aspects like poverty, gender, race, caste, class, region, disability, and community. And intergenerational transmission of privilege and inequality is really something we find all across forms of education and learning. The standardized nature and homogeneous nature of curriculum, that is the order of the day today, including pedagogic practices, including assessment ways, basically undermine and they invisibilize knowledge systems that are rooted in local communities, in diverse social indigenous contexts. And this homogenized knowledge alienates and disempowers communities. So that is what leads to poor learning outcomes, which we very easily call the learning crisis. The sort of newest form of layer of exclusion, I would say, that has been added is that of digital learning, because we know that there is limited access to technology. The fact that inequalities intersect comes out quite clearly in all of these researches, and I'll give you a few examples, one from Rwanda, and all these are clickable, and you can see these projects on the website. The Rwandan project that looks at employability finds that it's just not a question of employability because of poor education or poor development of skills, but that it's very intimately integrated and interwoven with multidimensional poverty contexts. In India, we find that women's teachers' work is devalued because there are intersecting frames of not only imposed Western formulations of professionalism, but in our own context, which is caste-based notions and community-based notions of ideal womanhood. We also found that there is a gendered nature of science institutions, which actually creates mechanisms of exclusion among the transgender, non-binary, non-conforming persons, and therefore creates an epistemological discourse that erases trans identity. We found that children of stigmatized workers, while they have aspirations, but the intergenerational inequalities sort of sustain because of the stigma associated and the fact that higher education institutes are apathetic towards their struggles. We also find that when we want to really address these intersecting inequalities, our research shows that we need to first problematize what these inequalities and how they intersect with each other. So the way to really problematize and understand is to foreground the voices, the perspectives, and the knowledge systems of the marginalized. And this is the way when societies will be in a better position when they hear these diverse voices to actually deconstruct challenging contradictions around coloniality, patriarchy, modernity, impact of climate change, racial, caste, social, spatial injustices. And knowledge creation, we find through these projects with diverse communities and local people, including children, can help us address cross-cutting inequalities, because this also helps us decolonize research, the way we do research, the way we co-create knowledge and develop newer insights, and of course, the practice of education itself. So for example, some of the projects tell us that the Adivasi community, which is really the tribal communities in India, and many other marginalized communities, they experience very selective kind of knowledge that is demanded that they internalize. But actually, this is not just a pedagogical problem, but it's a problem of whose knowledge is being represented. And the existing knowledge clearly, another project shows, is telling us that the processes and the selection of knowledge itself is actually fostering and augmenting a particular sort of development. And therefore, the larger question of sustainability is not just that of protecting our forests and ecologies in which people live, but also listening to their voices and represent their worldview across. The third section really talks about what are the kind of capacities, skills, knowledge, attitudes, agency that are required to tackle inequalities. We had some wonderful projects that had interventions, and through interventions, we were able to foreground some of these insights. For example, the fact that education can challenge social inequalities by actually challenging established norms and facilitate processes of transformation. We have a wonderful project in Rwanda that shows how the inclusion of marginalized voices in knowledge creation was able to empower women against gender-based violence, or that theater practices within the Indian context was able to create a dialogue-based pedagogy which empowered young women so that their grounded perspectives actually enabled them to become more resilient, to develop critical thinking and agency. And similarly, in South Africa, we found how a project was able to strengthen women's voices as they worked through a complex web of relations, organizational initiatives, and networks. In India, we found how there's a dissonance between textbooks, its knowledge, and children's lived experiences. By focusing on the everyday, how we can bridge this gap, and how Somalian project showed us that we can reduce inequalities by using a co-production method in research. And it's through research that we were able to actually demonstrate how this works. We also found that transformative pedagogies involve critical empathy. That's a very interesting idea that came out quite, and an ethics of care. And this was found to be something that helps you to confront, to challenge, to reflect, and to literally know through your body. I mean, it's more a visceral knowing. There was a wonderful project of South Africa called the Citizen Science Project that co-developed a shared methodology for restoring, re-remembering, and actually made visible the complexity of epistemic activity that generated ethics of engagement and transparency. They worked with universities as sustainable communities as an idea, where they actually enabled the co-creation of an African, indigenous, locally rooted, thanks, Samir.
Ma'am, if you can hear me, yeah.
Sorry?
2 minutes to the presentation.
Yeah. In Rwanda and Somalia, we found how processes of inclusivity are facilitated when marginalized communities are informed about the challenges and experiences they face. We found that in India, teachers who had been immersed in critical transformative education, their pedagogies help them play agentic roles within existing institutions in their classrooms to create cultures of possibility. And we also found that transformative education happens in non-hierarchical, democratic learning spaces where there is dialogue possible and where we include the lived experiences of the marginalized. There was a wonderful project of Somalia with the Bravanese community where they found that they were able to move beyond research for the underprivileged and how they were able to argue against inequality. Theater and performance indicated through an Indian project how there is a deep connection between historical processes and personal experiences, and how performance as pedagogy can contribute to self-awareness and how they affect the understanding of others. Engagement with children also was a project that enabled us to understand more nuanced manner the present human condition. And the first generation higher education students studied led us to understand transformative pedagogies and how they actually challenge questions and institutional processes of epistemic violence. And lastly, we were able to also demonstrate through wonderful research that transformative education also means enabling the privileged educators to confront their own privileges, to understand their role in sort of sustaining caste-based, gender, race-based social inequalities. And we had wonderful examples in this. For example, a collective reading of the autobiographical accounts of caste-based discrimination actually compelled many participants to acknowledge that the creation of select reading actually led them to look at their own selves and their privileges and how they become complicit in sustaining all of that. Individual narratives, both teachers and students also revealed that an education system that develops connections between individual biographies and socio-political histories can actually enable the unlearning of privilege without shame. And that is what is called critical pedagogy. I would now stop here and invite some of our participants who have actually done some of this research and could tell us, if you want to tell us your story, really very briefly, to share with all of us here a very major deep insight from your own work. Perhaps half a minute, 1 minute, so that we can have some more sharings. So I invite the TSF researchers from across all the 4 countries. Sukesh, Chaya, Justine, yeah. Jolly.
Hello.
Yes, Jolly, go ahead.
Thanks, Poonam, and thanks everyone. That was a very good summary showing some of the inequalities. I would just like to share my from our own research, which you touched on, about employability for the youth, especially the youth, the young women and girls who were missing out of employment, education, and training. And we found that, yes, these intersecting inequalities, a number of vulnerabilities to do with poverty, to do with being in remote areas and all that. But although it applied across for the boys and the girls had other issues also that have to do with gender norms and really tied them into this lack of employment, lack of accessing school or education or any kind of training. So yeah, what you say really is true, and we have to really find how. So we find that most of the proposals or recommendations that are usually given to improve or help girls access education are the kind of traditional ways of trying to give them materials. But we find that there is a whole range of other intersecting inequalities that really keep them back. So yes, that is our story from Rwanda, and we continue to look for solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jolly. Would anyone else like to share? And any questions around these projects? Justine, would you like to unmute yourself, please? We can't hear you.
Sure. Sorry for that. I always forget. I would like to share the experience during the implementation of projects empowering women to prevent GBV in one of the 6 districts in Rwanda. One of our lessons learned is that the inequality leads to another inequality. I would give you an example where the GBV perpetrated among couples led to inequality of education among children, where, for example, if the mother is experiencing GBV, then if children are going to school, then it's the girl to be stopped going to school, take care of the young ones, and the boy goes to school. So the inequalities between the adults affects or lead to the inequalities among the young ones, especially when we talk of education. We found that when we were starting the project, in one sector, about 15 children had dropped out of school. But at the end of the project, all the 15 children had gone back to school. So the learning of adults positively affected the learning of the young ones. Yep, I think that's the experience I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Justine. Priya, you have a question? Sure.
Thanks, Poonam. I just wanted to share a little bit from our learning in our project, which was the Citizen Science Geostories project. And what we learned as the research team, my colleague and I went in as the research team, and from the beginning of the project, we tried to co-design and talk about and honor co-expertise in the project, so that we had research expertise, but that wasn't the best expertise, the most important, the only. There were other types of expertise, and we worked quite hard to legitimate all the different types of expertise and to ensure that everything we did as a community was beneficial to everybody who was participatory. You know, often these projects where we come in with research funding, the researchers have clear benefits. We know what we're getting out of it. And the promise of future benefit is there for the rest of the participants. And in this project, what we tried to do was make sure that every single thing we did had immediate benefit and was immediately usable to everybody who contributed time and energy, and that it represented and spoke to the needs of both the field of practice and the space of research. And what we found was that we took up a different role as researchers. We turned into a team who was providing a service, a research capacity, a research translation, and the heart of the work was being done by the co-experts in the field. And that made the research very useful, and it gave the research a purpose, a real purpose. Yeah, so I thought I'd just highlight that role of research in collaboration. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Priya. I think that's another very powerful impact that we were able to have, which is to really change the way we're doing research. And I think there's a lot that we can take forward for academic communities. Samina, would you like to share something? Yeah.
Hi. So since this is a legacy conference, I wanted to share something. I'm working on something which has emerged as part of the legacy of my project for TESF. So I'm working on a podcast of poetry written by children in the workshops that I've done as part of the TESF project. And I've just recorded with part of the podcasts are going to be sort of comments from other people, writers, artists, educators. So I've just recorded with 2 people for 2 episodes, and I just would like to share what they had to say, because I think that kind of tells us, you know, what is the potential and the possibilities that lie in this project. So there is one episode which is on a set of a collection of poems on the idea of being Indian, and a very well-known poet here who writes in Hindi, Sushil Shukla, had this to say. He says, I saw both hope and a warning in these poems. If I read them from the perspective of the effect of poetry, the way it speaks, the idiom, then, for example, we say, Hamari dal roti chal rahi hai, meaning we are managing our daily bread, our livelihood. So then here, dal roti includes everything. It includes chicken, it includes all of life, everything. So from that perspective, these poems are poems about life. The poets are acknowledging that what they eat, where they move around, play, whom they meet, how they take pleasure in life, that's what makes them Indian. These poems make the idea of being Indian wide and expansive. No one gets left out. That's what I think is the most beautiful thing about these poems. But if we think about an adult writing these, an adult saying that someone is Indian because they eat dal roti, then that can become a dangerous idea. It points us towards being alert to our context and that we have to keep the fragrance of life alive in our children's poetry. We have to encourage them to believe in the inclusive fragrance that is their idea of being Indian. And there's one more by another writer, poet Anushka Ravi Shankar, to an episode where there are 2 poems on freedom, on the prompt of we discussed liberty as one of the things that are guaranteed by the Constitution of India. And Anushka had this to say: I was blown away when I read these poems. What excites me about poetry is that it looks at something you see every day and suddenly it perceive it in a completely new and surprising way. Rhythm and musicality are also intrinsic to the form. These poems are so well crafted. They're both musical and insightful. I love the sudden leap from mundane, everyday freedoms like the freedom to talk in school or the freedom to wear what one likes to insights like there is no freedom where there is discrimination, and that not being noticed is also a kind of freedom. That's pretty amazing. Behind the lines written by these children, I can hear their voices and their concerns, and I can feel their yearning for freedom in every sense of the word. It's exactly what poetry should do. So I just feel that, responses from people who have, they have no other idea of what we sort of have been through. They're just responding to the work that came out of the project. I think it just tells us that there is so much that we can do with what we've managed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Samina. There's a specific question in the chat about wanting to know how privileged educators actually were able to acknowledge their sort of role in sustaining inequalities. And I think these came from a couple of projects, but I don't see Sujata here from India or Shalini. But what we'll do is we'll provide you a link. Maybe Simran can do that, a link to both the projects. And I don't know if Priya would like to say anything on that, because I think some of it did come through some of the South African researchers as well.
Sure, thanks, Poonam. I don't have a wide grasp of the findings of all of the South African projects, but I know in our space what that required was making our privilege visible and constantly bringing it into the space and inviting challenge and inviting a shifting of that was useful, not just tokenistic. It involved deliberately sharing the power from the beginning, so making decisions, hard decisions, rather than the easier in practice decisions, the hard decisions about what we were doing and how we were doing it, and then demonstrating how we were dealing with the feedback, how we were taking very seriously the challenges that our co-experts were bringing. I'm trying to think of some specific examples. One of the big things is we created geo-stories, and we had this wonderful idea of what they would be at the beginning. And every one of the projects reclaimed that and turned it into what they needed. And, we tried a couple of times to redirect, and they were just like, no, you said that we must make what is useful to us. This is what we need. We're doing this. And that required us to change to align with what we had offered into the space and become more responsible for the way we were working with it. And I think what it requires is constantly bringing it into the space and helping other people to see how we're privileged, and then inviting that challenge and taking the challenge seriously. It's exhausting and liberating.
Yes,
Yeah.
Thank you. That was very interesting. And I think some of the projects in India actually were able to also demonstrate how engaged and how the privileged actually developed feelings of guilt as they confronted, the kind of inequalities and their complicity. And that itself became a very important part of the discourse of looking at transformative pedagogies. So, Kesh, would you like to add something now?
Yes, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, I just like to share something from our project. It's just a small quote, and I think it kind of highlights sort of the complexity of the whole thing. So in our project, we set out to investigate this idea of agency, and for us at the beginning, it was kind of simple. Oh yeah, we're setting out to investigate agency, and we kind of assumed, agency means something. But then as we went through it, we kind of realized that actually it's so complex. And some of the things that we had in mind were, we had these notions which we had to question ourselves. There's a quote from a teacher educator. She practices theater, and I'm just going to offer you just that quote to highlight what I'm saying about the idea of complexity, agency, and transformation. So she said, when I go to schools and I offer theater workshops, I never tell them, the schools, the whole story. I never say what is possible in this workshop. Can you imagine telling a headmaster that your teachers will start to think for themselves? It's not what they want to hear, right? So I kind of say something like, teachers are performers, and this will give them greater confidence. And it's not a lie, right? So this really complicates the issue of agency and transformation, and almost pits agency and transformation against each other, because transformation, while desirable, seems to require agency, which requires independent thinking, which seems to be an undesirable trait.
Okay, thank you, Sukesh. Yeah, well, that sort of demonstrates the complexity with which they're dealing. There were interesting examples that actually demonstrated how this was made possible. And of course, there's always a challenge, I guess. Anybody else? We have maybe just a couple of minutes before we get into the last section of this session. Would anybody else like to share? Rafael, would you like to say something?
I'm just very grateful for the insights that people have shared this morning through this session. And I'm also wondering where we go next from this, in terms of it. This has been a really novel experience, and how insights from this, particularly methodological ones, can be incorporated in work moving forwards. So that's, I guess I'm throwing it back a question really, around how we consolidate and take forward learnings from this in teaching around research methods. And I'm focusing on research there, but it applies for other areas as well, like teacher education as well.
Sure. In fact, that sort of takes us straight into the last part of this session, where I could share some of the key messages that we think within this theme of tackling intersecting inequalities that we've been able to draw out of the projects, the TESF projects. So let me share my screen again. Does this work? Yeah. So here it is. And what we have here is, the last part, this is it, which is how do we address intersecting inequalities in education? And this is really a call to action, but of course it is a tall order. And yet let's look at some of the key things that sort of emerge from these researchers for 4 kinds of stakeholders. So we're looking at researchers, we're looking at educators and teachers, policy actors, and engaged activists. So it'll be nice if some of us in this room who are researchers and independent or within universities or otherwise could sort of, respond to this. So what we've really been able to cull out is the fact that we need interdisciplinary research that will enable us to examine intersecting inequalities and how educational inequality actually sustains all other kinds of inequalities, whether it's epistemic, spatial, environmental injustice, social, gender. And what we found through this research is that in the interdisciplinary frames of research, we've been able to understand an interdisciplinary approach because we were able to bring in voices and perspectives of the most marginalized, the most vulnerable. So listening to them is what really helped us to develop this frame. For educators and teachers, what we thought is that what comes out quite clearly is that we need to look at both curricula and pedagogic practices that are more equitable, inclusive, critical, and transgressive. So which means that, challenging or even enabling pedagogic practices that teach you to resist, that enable you to develop agency, and of course, self-reflexivity is what is very critical for transformative change. So if there are anybody in the audience who'd like a question around this, or to share something that has been more challenging, or that has been, very sort of that resonates with what we have been able to put together or foreground, would be welcome. In terms of policy, of course, the most challenging space, but we did find that out of the 4 countries, Somalia was exceptional in being able to influence the policy space, maybe the kind of context they're in. In India, we found it really, really tough. But what the policy makers need to address is to actually first review inequality. And here we're talking of the theme, really, and how inequality is sort of sustaining and happening in and through education. And therefore, then think of instituting mechanisms towards a more equitable quality education, which means looking at curricula, pedagogy, because a whole lot of policy decisions around curriculum pedagogy seem to happen without looking at the diversity in terms of the communities, in terms of, all the kinds of inequalities and challenges, and of course, even care for the planet. For engaged activists, really, I think it's important that we, while we address the policy actors, we also acknowledge the role of the community and civil society, which in this kind of a political, economic environment we have is becoming very muted. But it's important to encourage civil society groups along with policymakers to undertake audits, social audits, education audits, gender audits, and examine policy as it's unfolding on the ground, and how we can actually influence measures of course correction. I think it's important that these groups get involved because policymakers are quite happy not doing audits, or perhaps not taking that very seriously, but it's like a watch that comes from within society. So these are really the 4 key messages and call to action that we were able to put together. I invite all of us here to comment, to ask questions, to share, and perhaps even debate. I'll leave this slide here so that people can look at it as they think.
Hello?
So, yeah. Yes, Jolly? Go ahead.
Thank you so much again for elaborating that. I don't know if I can touch on a question that I see in the chat that was asked about our project. And yes, coming back to what Poonam, you were talking about. In our project, because we were really focusing on the specific group of young women and girls who are not in employment, in education. And we are talking about girls ranging from the age of 16 and 30, because that's how we describe the youth in Rwanda. And of course, we looked at 2 districts, and they tended to have the highest numbers of girls in that category. And yes, in terms of really how this can inform policy, most of you may know that we have good policies in Rwanda regarding women, girls in education, but we still see a number of youth, especially young women and girls, who are not really employed or in education. So we find that this issue of really co-creation of knowledge and working together.
We've lost you, Jolly. We can't hear you.
Oh. Hello?
Oh.
Can you hear me?
She was audible.
Yeah.
She.
Now we can hear you. Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry. Sorry, yeah, so I don't know where I could start, but yeah, I was just trying to share that the issue of I mean, in Rwanda, there are kind of good policies regarding girls' education, but we find that, yeah, there are really pockets and the differences within even if Rwanda is really a small country, especially the rural areas, the girls, and even urban, because we did, like, one of our district was really peri-urban. And so there are specific issues within specific districts and contexts. So that issue of really working closely with communities when you're identifying a problem to solve, rather than having a policy that is really broad, that tends to cover all communities in the same way, could also be a way of helping to address some of these issues, so that in talking to the girls themselves, this is where and even their family, their parents and brothers and the communities where we worked, some of these issues came out that really the issue is not necessarily only poverty alone, but all these intersecting issues and gender norms, and girls, most of them had dropped out because they either fell pregnant or had unwanted pregnancies and couldn't continue with school. Issues of sexual reproductive health, there are a kind of a number of issues. So it's the specificity of each area, I think, could be a good place to start. And this issue of co-creating knowledge and discussing and talking, even to the girls themselves, if you want to find a way to address some of these issues, I think can help. Let me stop and give a chance to others. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jolly. Is that Mate? Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, hello. No, I had a question because this is fascinating. I wanted to know if it would be interesting also to make evident the role of kids and youth as key actors of the process, because I was looking like here, researchers, teachers, educators, and everything, and I have the feeling listening to everybody. So I'm just here to listen and to learn, actually, but that role of kids has been very much, and youth acknowledged and as full actors also in this process. And yeah, I would just be interesting, what are the experiences related to them, and if it would be interesting to make it more visible as key actors of this process too.
Yeah, thanks. Yes, that's very critical. Would anybody like to respond to this? I know that Samina has done work with children. Samina?
Yeah, hi. No, I absolutely think so. I think that the project for me has really helped me to understand how, if we are to listen to children and include children's voice in trying to sort of understand larger ideas of the sort of human condition that we are trying, the challenges that we are faced with, as well as making sense of the kind of societies that we inhabit, then I think that children's voice can contribute significantly to developing those understandings. And in my project, the understanding of citizenship really sort of, I think, opened up for me, certainly. And I hope to, through the work that will carry on for others, because children spoke about sort of the idea of the citizen in very sort of from their lived experience in what seemed like commonplace kind of way, but as more in terms of the idea of an inhabitant, a resident, a denizen. So I think that this, if we are to listen to children with regards to citizenship, it makes us question this idea of, who deserves liberty, equality, fraternity, who does not deserve liberty, equality, fraternity. And so I would imagine then that even on other ideas and other kind of complex questions that we are grappling with, children's lived experiences are important for us to listen to. And so, of course, they should be key participants. That would be my takeaway from the project.
Thanks, thanks, Samina. Any policy thinkers here? Anybody'd like to sort of, comment on how one looks at the policy space and involve policymakers to take some of the work forward? Any questions, of course, any challenges? So I guess the policy space isn't always an easy space to engage and talk about, especially when yes. Rachel, please go ahead. Yeah.
Thanks very much. And thanks everyone. Yeah, absolutely fascinating insights, which I'll be thinking over for a long time to come, I'm sure. Something that strikes me is that through your work, you've been able to highlight complexity and intersectionality, as you've discussed, through lived experience, using, for example, narratives and poetry in ways that, far beyond any academic discourse, demonstrate complexity. And I think this challenge for education systems, policy, curriculum, teacher education, to engage with complexity, to recognize the world as a complex socio-ecological space, political complex space. Yet it's a huge challenge for policymakers, and teacher educators working in these systems that are designed as a kind of logical framework, top-down, factory kind of model. So, yeah, I'm also grappling with the scale of the challenge, but I'm sure that the work that you've done is crucial in terms of enabling the expression of these complex realities for people to engage with. And it makes me think within my space of teacher education that could be a bridge between research and practice. So let's not talk about complexity academically, but engage with complex lived experience. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much for that. I think it's so important what you said. In fact, I think if you're able to engage teachers through our free service programs and, of course, ongoing professional support, that means we're really able to widen our base in terms of reaching to a larger number of children. And in one of the projects in India, we have been able to demonstrate through research how a 30-year-old experiment, I don't even know whether I should call it an experiment because it's 30 years old, and a radically different teacher ed program was actually able to create phenomenally powerful learning spaces using theater, using music, using academic theory, using practice-based field projects and so on. And yes, we've been able to demonstrate through this research. None of the researchers are here, unfortunately, to share that just now. But I also want to share with you that as Sukesh said, this is not something desirable. And as you also said, policymakers may not really, sort of take to this kind of thinking of transformative education, especially in the teacher education space. But I must share with you with some sorrow that there is a challenge to this 30-year-old program right now, as the political regime sort of comes heavily on any of these transformative processes. So the questions of policy are not only about instituting these ideas, but also sustaining them over the years. And I completely agree with you. And I think it's like democracy. It's like the work of democracy, that there is no finished product. It's a work in progress. Yeah, thanks. Thanks very much. Yeah, so we have a little bit more time. Anybody else?
Poonam, sorry, I'm coming in. I just wonder if you could share something about the teacher education program. I know you're developing a teacher education program based on work that's been done in this context. I wonder if you could just briefly share any details around that.
Oh, okay. Well, it's it's a 4-year program, and it started in 1994. In fact, right in the beginning of neoliberal, policies coming into place. But we were able to do that because we were low key, and we just did our work quietly. It's running in the constituent colleges of the University of Delhi, but no more than 8 colleges, even though we have over 70 colleges. But that's because expansion was always resisted by policymakers. The program actually radically departs from the existing model that we had of teacher preparation, which was largely 1 year, and which was really rooted in the colonial frame of looking at even the methods of teaching pedagogy as merely essentialist knowledge that only looks at how do you use inductive and deductive methods to teach science or to teach mathematics. But the BLA program really is one that looks at the child as a human being, and not somebody who will be prepared, or rather the teacher as a person, not somebody who will become a historian or a chemist or a physicist alone, but somebody who engages with looking at education and the way education is located in the larger political, social, cultural fabric and frame of the country. And of course, the country itself is diverse, so one looks at more local sort of knowledges as well. And it also departs by giving the student teachers a lot of space through different ways of knowing, including theater and self-development, where they develop their own vision of education. They sort of look at some of the excellent philosophies around education thinkers, but to also understand their own vision and their own understanding. I think we have just about a minute left, or less than that, to get out of the breakout room. But there's more, and I think the TSF project on this, there are 3 parts to it, and all 3 parts have pretty elaborate reports. We've got wonderful narratives from student teachers and alumni who tell us what they've gone through, and of course, some of the gaps of the program that need to be also addressed. But it's been a very rewarding experience for many of us, and also very challenging. Thanks. So I think we're going to leave the breakout room and we'll meet together in the larger group. Thanks very much, everyone, for sharing and for asking
questions. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, that was excellent. Thanks.
Thank you.